fighting games. I can remember all the way back to stuff like Karate Champ hitting the arcade scene in the early 1980s. They pitted two fighters against one another in Mortal Kombat, and only one could be the winner. The genre grew slowly from there, and it was 1987 Street Fighter that really captured my attention. Ever since then, the genre has bloomed into tons of different properties spanning both 2D and 3D technology. Both the Sega Saturn and Sega Dreamcast just happened to be bastions of strength for the genre between the mid-1990s and early 2000s. There was a stretch of time there where these two machines were the place to be if you enjoyed arcade games at home. The Saturn had the added benefit of RAM expansions, and the Dreamcast was based on the Naomi arcade platform that many fighting games at the time used. It was a glorious stretch of time to be a Sega fighting game fan as well, as home ports of the Virtua Fighter series, Fighting Vipers, Last Bronx, and others made their way home in fine form. Comparing these two machines in this category may be easy for some of you, but for me, it was extremely difficult to pick a clear-cut winner. The video you are about to watch covers my opinions and experiences with the genre on these two systems, and I pick an overall winner for which one has the best fighting game library. I hope you guys enjoy Saturn vs. Dreamcast, the fighting games. Both the Saturn and Dreamcast received numerous games that appeared first on the Neo Geo. Many of these titles required the use of the RAM expansion cartridge on the Saturn because of their relative enormous sizes at the time. The Dreamcast, of course, had no such issues thanks to its copious amounts of internal RAM. Comparing the two sets of titles, you get some great representation across the board. The Saturn received King of Fighters 95, 96, and 97. While the Dreamcast received King of Fighters 98, 99, 2000, 2001, and 2002. The Dreamcast port of 98 was called Dream Match 99, and it received a graphical update with 3D backgrounds, a version you couldn't play anywhere else at the time of its release. The Saturn version of 95 was pretty special itself, using a dedicated ROM cartridge to hold game assets for faster loading. It was only one of a couple of games to do this on the Saturn, and the results were quite good. This category could be determined simply by your affinity for a certain game in the series. If you were partial to King of Fighters 98 for instance, the Dreamcast wins here just for that. While all these versions were actually quite good, the nod here has to go to the Dreamcast for the overall closeness to the Neo Geo versions, and the fact there are more of them. These are 5 excellent Neo Geo ports that stand the test of time, and are still quite fun to play today. But what about the other Neo Geo games on the two platforms? The Dreamcast received an excellent port of The Last Blade 2, while the Saturn got Samurai Showdown 3 and 4. The Dreamcast got Fatal Fury Mark of the Wolves, and the Saturn got Real Bout Fatal Fury, Real Bout Fatal Fury Special, and Fatal Fury 3. From there we get a ton of divergence. World Heroes Perfect, Galaxy Fight, Ragnagard, Fighters History Dynamite, and Waku Waku 7 appeared on the Saturn, giving the Saturn a lineup and variety the Dreamcast simply doesn't have. This really does make the comparison quite a bit more complicated. It's true that the Dreamcast got some of the later games on the Neo Geo, but in regards to pure variety, the Saturn wins hands down. This is actually an element of this comparison that comes up again and again. Variety and number of titles versus your love of certain games considered to be more mature in regards to mechanics and visuals. One thing you really can't argue is the power difference between these two systems. I mean, the Saturn was 1994 technology, while the Dreamcast was pretty much exactly 4 years worth of evolution from there. An eternity by technology standards. This translated to radically improved 3D polygon performance across pretty much everything, and fighting games benefited heavily. I can spew a whole pile of bullshit about gameplay, charm, and replayability, but the simple fact is, most of the 3D fighters between these two do not compare well at all. the Dreamcast dominates this section in just about all aspects. Just putting the two lists side by side of 3D fighting games is all the real proof you need. Compare something like Soul Calibur to Last Bronx or the Toshinden games, and there is no competition. Dead or Alive against Dead or Alive 2, no competition. Fighting Vipers against its sequel, no competition. Capcom's 3D lineup pretty much single-handedly wipes the floor with everything 3D on the Saturn by themselves. I mean, Power Stone 1 and 2 don't really have any real competition available on Saturn, and even when you include something like Virtual On in the conversation, the Dreamcast has one of its own that's better looking. Add in the likes of Project Justice, Tech Romancer, Plasma Sword, and Arena Combat titles like Heavy Metal and Spawn, and it's a slaughter. Only the likes of Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighters Megamix really stand their ground for the Saturn based on their content and gameplay, but that's a small bright spot in an otherwise crushing defeat. The Dreamcast's 3D fighting lineup has a variety and visual punch the Saturn never had, and it makes this category an easy one to call. I love my Saturn, but when it comes to 3D fighting games, the Dreamcast takes this comparison by a mile. When comparing the two library of fighting games, the category I affectionately refer to as the Oddballs must be given some time. These are the games from companies that didn't make a lot of fighting games or didn't make a lot of that particular IP. This category carries weight because these games are often enjoyed by casuals who don't play this type of software often or as seriously as the diehard fans who spend countless hours counting frames and dissecting hitboxes, yet still number in the millions. The Dreamcast has a number of these types of games, starting with stuff like Guilty Gear X, which was definitely an outlier back then. It has a great look to its animation and runs in a higher resolution than most 2D games at the time. Psychic Force 2012 was actually a sequel to Taito's earlier effort, Psychic Force, and it had some rather unique gameplay where it did battle inside a cube. Think of this as kind of a Fighting Vipers-like Caged Arena. It's actually not a bad game and has many fans out there. I'd even throw in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure into this category. This was based on the Japanese comic book series and has loads of fans. The Dreamcast game actually contains two titles, JoJo's Venture and its sequel JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. While Capcom did do these titles, it differs from their usual work a bit because of the stand system, which were sorta like powered up versions of the fighters using them. There were of course other JoJo fighting games years later, but at the time this series was not well known or widely played. The closest thing the Saturn has to it is Rabbit, which was decent itself, but lacks the polish and discipline of Capcom's title. The Ultimate Fighting Championship could go into this category as well. The UFC was young back then, and this caged fighting game that mixes boxing, wrestling, and martial arts was still quite a good experience. It looked fairly solid as well. But no matter which way you slice it, the Saturn completely dominates this category. The sheer variety of offerings that hit Sega's 32-bit machine is almost overwhelming. I compiled a list of games I put into this batch and was completely blown away by the number of them. Astra Superstars was a really nice aerial combat fighter that played great. Asuka 120% Burning Fest Limited had great animation and was kind of a 2D predecessor to the rival Skulls games. Battle Monsters was a strange, multi-tiered fighter with wacky characters and gameplay. DXerd is a weapons-based fighter in the vein of Battle Arena Toshinden, which itself appeared on the Saturn twice. There are multiple Dragon Ball Z fighters on the Saturn, each with different gameplay, and Capcom's Final Fight Revenge was definitely not their normal style of fighter. Sega had Golden Axe The Duel, which was a 2D fighting title that used many similar assets from their famous beat-em-up series. Groove On Fight was another entry into the Power Instinct series of fighting games, and was a tag team fighter with great animation and unique characters. Data East did Dark Legend and its update on the Saturn, a 2D fighter that first appeared on the STV Titan. Savaki is a caged fighter kinda similar to what you'd get with a kickboxing game, and actually doesn't play bad at all. Soko Setokai is a nice looking fighter that has bright colorful graphics and gameplay that more than stands up to the other offerings at the time. Even freaking Ultraman had a fighting game on the Saturn, one of the few games that used a dedicated ROM cart like King of Fighters 95. Sega's All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua plays as fast and fluid as a one-on-one fighter, but also offers a robust wrestling engine with tons of moves and strategies. Zero Divide: The Final Conflict is a 3D fighter reminiscent of Sega's Virtua Fighter, and has some really abstract artwork that sets it apart. It runs great too. Hell man, I could keep on going as there are even more, but you get the point. The Saturn has loads of variety in this category that goes well beyond the Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat titles that dominated in popularity. The Saturn wins this section as purely as the Dreamcast dominated the 3D fighters we covered earlier.
Fatality.
By the time the Saturn and PlayStation got going strong, we were on the third Mortal Kombat game. Sony scored a 32-bit exclusive on that first, but Sega got one of their own with its update, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. This expanded the fighter roster, added even more tweaks and moves, and added some new stages to fight on. Believe it or not, even the classic Mortal Kombat 2 was released on the Saturn, a visually stunning port that looked just like the arcade. It was missing sound effects and played differently, but I have seen many fans say it's their favorite version. Mortal Kombat Trilogy was a remix of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, adding in more fighters and options from the previous games. Again, there are missing sound effects here, and some of the graphical effects are inferior to the PlayStation version, but many Saturn owners thought it an excellent title. By comparison, the Dreamcast only received one game in this series, Mortal Kombat Gold, an updated version of Mortal Kombat 4. This was a polygon take on the formula, and while I know many of you like it, I can't stand it. It plays funky, looks worse, and just isn't a very good title. The three Saturn releases certainly have their issues, but they all are quite a bit better than the Dreamcast offering. While we all like different kinds of fighting games, it would be quite wrong of me not to focus on Capcom's significant contributions to the genre. During the Saturn and Dreamcast runs, they were a major force in pretty much every kind of fighter available. Whether it be 2D, 3D, tag team, or arena based, Capcom was pumping out quality titles multiple times a year. It could be argued that this single company contributed heavily to the appeal of both of these machines, and neither one would have been the same without them. Comparing the games Capcom made for both of them proved a daunting task, pretty much because nearly every single one is not only worth playing, but also worth owning. Even when Capcom didn't hit a home run, the end product was still more playable than a lot of the stuff from other companies. The lead off here would be the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy against the Street Fighter 3 games. The Saturn received all three Street Fighter Alpha games, including Part 2's Alpha Gold update. The Dreamcast received all three games in the Street Fighter 3 trilogy. The first two were compiled together in a single package called Street Fighter Double Impact, while the third got a standalone release all its own. While many prefer one over the other, they were all really nice core additions to the Street Fighter universe of games. Both systems got some great representation on the tag team versus front. The Saturn received X-Men vs. Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, a great mix of fighters that covered a ton of different characters from the two brands. They both used the 4MB RAM expansion to give visuals that stood well next to their arcade counterparts, and were definite highlights during the Saturn's run. The Dreamcast got Marvel vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, games that expanded the two licenses even deeper and added even more fighters from the broader spectrum of games and stories. Of course, thanks to all that added RAM in the Dreamcast and the fact that Part 2 was actually Naomi based, these ports are very nice. Perfect even. Many have their preferences here, but all four of these games are incredibly fun. The three entries into the Capcom vs. SNK series hit the Dreamcast. These answered the millions of prayers sent out by fight fans wanting to see the crossover, and they themselves are killer games. A huge variety of fighters, great backgrounds, and a ratio system that govern the tag team gameplay all made it its own thing different from the feel of other Versus titles. These are not easily overlooked, and incredible additions to the Dreamcast library. The Saturn was able to hold its ground thanks to a bunch of other properties the Dreamcast never received. X-Men Children of the Atom was on Saturn fairly early in its life, and despite not using the RAM expansion, was still a solid port with killer gameplay. All three of the original releases of Street Fighter II were on the Saturn in one package under the Capcom Generation 5. Whether you enjoyed the slow pace of the original or the blistering pace of Turbo, they were there. The Strangeness of Street Fighter the movie was also on the Saturn, a digitized take on the movie that used the actors' likenesses and scenes from the film for the backgrounds. Pocket Fighter was sort of a playful, laid-back take on Street Fighter with cute animations and chibi art style design. Marvel's Superheroes was sort of a semi-sequel to Children of the Atom, and focused on the use of Infinity Gems to power up your fighters, a feature I wish they had expanded and deepened in the Versus series. It had some peculiar slowdown, but like I said, there really was no such thing as a truly awful Capcom game. Finally, Cyberbots was on the Saturn, a mech fighter with superb animation and gameplay that felt very different from the usual Street Fighter affair. Comparing these two Capcom libraries boils down quite simply to taste and preference for certain properties. I prefer the Alpha games over Street Fighter III, for example. They all were excellent options for their time, however, and I wouldn't strongly recommend one over the other because of that. There are just so many Capcom games here that stand the test of time, and remain quite playable even now, 20 years later. Capcom was the fight game king, and their presence was very much appreciated on both platforms. During the lives of the Saturn and Dreamcast, we received a handful of titles that were available on both. Super Street Fighter II X Grandmaster Challenge, which was just the Japanese name of Super Street Fighter II Turbo, appeared on both. The Dreamcast version was only available in Japan via their online store, and the Saturn version appeared in the Street Fighter Collection. Both of these are quite playable and visually very appealing. Arcade perfect is often a term nitpicked to death based on variants that affect how they feel in play, but both these versions feel absolutely fine to me. The Dreamcast version appears to have more frames of animation and includes more speed options, while the Saturn sprites appear larger due to resolution differences. Also on both machines was the fantastic Vampire Savior, the third game in the Dark Stalker series. Both were Japanese exclusive, though the Dreamcast was again a mail-order release and fell under the title Vampire Chronicle. Again, both versions are excellent. The Saturn edition uses the 4MB RAM expansion and has loads of impressive animation from the arcade. The Dreamcast does a beautiful job as well, actually expanding the gameplay options to include all the playstyles from all the other games in the series. When you choose your fighter, you get a choice of how they play. This actually mixes things up quite a bit and allows you to play it like your favorite entry. Since the Saturn also received Vampire Hunter, this is another one where the end result is a series of games so well done, they all look and play great. Again, the Saturn sprites look larger here and the opening cinema is vastly superior. The Dreamcast intro was butchered down to a low-res movie that looks just terrible in comparison. Finally, we have Street Fighter Alpha 3, or 03 in Japan. Again, both machines received it, and again, both did admirable jobs. Both ports have a variety of extra modes to keep you playing, and they both have more animation than the PlayStation version that preceded them. I could play either version all day long, but I prefer the Saturn game here for a few reasons. First, the Saturn fighters look larger because of the differences in resolution. The Saturn stretches things a bit, but the end result is quite appealing to my eyes. I also prefer the Saturn's reverse dramatic battle options, which is a handicapped fight with you against two AI-controlled opponents. It actually moves fight to fight similar to the arcade mode and has various combinations of fighters. It's hard and a great addition no other version had until the PSP edition was released. In the end, these games do all their platforms proud and give us some great options to play. The Dreamcast versions all had Japanese matching service options for online play during their day, but that ended shortly after the demise of the platform. So, with all that said, what's the final verdict? I have to confess my initial opinion was they both did this genre so much justice, it was a tie. I mean, how could you honestly put down one enough to justify the other? There are just so many great fighting games here, and there are a number of them that still have no modern release to enjoy. But I didn't set out to give you a tie, so without further delay, the winner is the Sega Saturn. The Dreamcast holds its own without question, but when it comes to sheer number and variety of different properties, the Saturn wins this battle. It has more games from more developers, and again, many more that still have no ports to other platforms. While the Dreamcast certainly lays the smackdown in the 3D portion of the comparison, the number of 2D fighters on the Saturn simply cannot be denied. I really did try to find a common ground in between objectivity and subjectivity. I considered games I personally don't find all that appealing while still playing up the ones that I do. I really did try to give a fair shot to both, and I think I succeeded overall. For the rest of you, I think where your loyalties lie will likely be determined by your favorites. If you prefer the King of Fighters games, for instance, the Dreamcast had more of them and some of the better ones in the series. If you love the Capcom vs titles, the Capcom vs SNK and Marvel vs Street Fighter entries will give the Dreamcast the win here easily. The same goes for the 3D lineup on the Dreamcast. If your heart was set on those titles, the Saturn simply pales next to it overall. However, variety really is the great equalizer in this case, and definitely swings the argument in the Saturn's favor. It just has so many fighting games of varying type, you can't help but be impressed. That makes the Saturn my overall pick for best library in this genre. To tell you the truth though, the real winner here are the Sega fans during the life of these two machines. They may not have gotten the likes of Metal Gear Solid or Final Fantasy VII, but nobody can look down on the fighting game libraries these two platforms blessed their audience with. They were plentiful and varied, and gave us all something to be proud of. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.